The grand glass doors of Thompson Towers reflected the golden glow of the setting sun as Matthew Thompson stepped out of his sleek black SUV. His custom-tailored suit, made of fine Italian fabric, clung perfectly to his frame. His polished leather shoes clicked sharply against the concrete sidewalk, a rhythmic sound that echoed down the otherwise quiet street. At 35 years old, Matthew had it all. A successful career as CEO of a billion-dollar tech company, a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a panoramic view of Manhattan, and a lifestyle that screamed power, wealth, and influence. To many, Matthew was the epitome of success. He had worked hard for everything he owned, fought tooth and nail to climb to the top, and now he was untouchable. But as he walked toward the entrance of his luxurious office building, something caught his eye. Sitting on the cold, cracked pavement right outside the glass doors of Thompson Towers was a man. He was elderly, probably in his late 60s or early 70s, with a scruffy gray beard and a tattered coat that barely shielded him from the chilly fall air. His eyes, though worn with age, still held a sharpness that was almost unsettling. He didn't move as Matthew approached, only lifting his head slightly, his gaze locking with Matthew's. Matthew immediately felt a wave of discomfort. He hadn't expected to see anyone sitting on the sidewalk, especially not outside his building. The wealthy neighborhood was pristine, lined with towering skyscrapers and high-end boutiques. Not the place for someone like this. "Hey, you! Get up and move!" Matthew called out, his voice carrying a sharp edge. He didn't slow his pace, not even for a second. "This isn't the place for you. Go find somewhere else to be." His tone was dismissive, as if he were addressing an inconvenience, not a person. The man didn't flinch. He simply stared back at Matthew, unbothered by the harsh words. His hand, rough and weathered from years of life on the streets, was raised slightly as if to acknowledge Matthew, but he didn't attempt to stand. "I just want to talk to you, son," the man said, his voice gravelly, as though speaking was a struggle. His eyes never left Matthew's, their intensity making Matthew pause for a moment, just long enough to process what had been said. "Son?" The word hung in the air, and Matthew's heart skipped a beat. For a second, he thought maybe the man had mistaken him for someone else. He couldn't remember the last time someone had called him son, especially not a homeless person. Matthew felt a brief flicker of confusion, but it was quickly replaced by irritation. This was absurd. The nerve of this man. Who did he think he was, calling him son? Matthew was a successful businessman, someone with a reputation, someone who didn't have time for people like him, people who were clearly lost, out of touch with reality, and utterly irrelevant in the grand scheme of things. "Listen," Matthew said, his voice rising with frustration. "You don't belong here. People like you." He paused and caught himself before he said something he'd regret. But the man was already looking at him with such an intense expression that Matthew couldn't help himself. "You need to move along. This building is for people who actually matter, not for whatever you are." The old man's expression didn't change. He didn't seem offended, didn't flinch, didn't even seem surprised. He simply sat there waiting, as if he'd known Matthew would say something like that. It was unsettling. For a brief moment, Matthew wondered if he should stop and listen to what the man had to say. But that thought quickly evaporated. He had no time for this. He had meetings to attend, deals to close, people to impress. Matthew turned on his heel and made his way toward the entrance of Thompson Towers. But as he did, he felt a strange tug at his conscience. a strange weight. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the encounter. He quickly pushed it aside, telling himself it was nothing more than an inconvenience he could easily forget. But as he walked into the lobby, the strange, unsettling feeling lingered. The lobby of Thompson Towers was the epitome of luxury. Polished marble floors, sleek modern furniture, and a massive chandelier that hung overhead, casting a warm, golden light. The receptionist, a young woman in a perfectly pressed uniform, greeted him with a professional smile as he entered. "Good evening, Mr. Thompson," she said, and Matthew nodded in acknowledgement as he made his way to the elevator. His mind was still preoccupied with the man outside. Something about that encounter didn't sit right with him, but he couldn't figure out what it was. He stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the 32nd floor, where his penthouse awaited him. The doors slid shut and the familiar, smooth motion of the elevator took him up, but his mind remained distracted. As he entered his penthouse, the familiar luxury of his space wrapped around him like a warm blanket. The living room had floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city lights below. He tossed his keys on the coffee table and sank into the plush sofa, his eyes staring out at the city. But his thoughts weren't on the skyscrapers or the expensive art adorning the walls. His mind kept drifting back to the homeless man. "Son," the word echoed in his head. Matthew shook his head, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. The discomfort he felt wasn't something he wanted to dwell on, and it wasn't something that mattered in the grand scheme of his life. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Not just yet. The days following Matthew's encounter with the elderly man on the sidewalk were filled with the usual hustle and bustle of his high-powered life. Meetings, emails, phone calls, and deadlines filled every waking moment. Yet, no matter how hard he tried, that brief interaction kept resurfacing in his mind, like a song stuck on repeat. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Why would he? It was a fleeting moment, an encounter with a homeless man that meant nothing really. But there was something about the way the man had looked at him, the way he had called him son. It haunted him, unsettling him in ways he couldn't explain. Matthew tried to push it all aside, diving deeper into work. He had to. There were deals to close, clients to impress, and a reputation to maintain. His life had been built on the foundation of success, and he wasn't about to let some random street encounter shake that. Yet, even as he sat at his desk, his fingers tapping away at the keyboard, a nagging thought gnawed at the back of his mind. He didn't even know the man's name. That night, after a long day of meetings and conference calls, Matthew stood at his kitchen counter, staring down at a glass of bourbon. The amber liquid swirled in the glass as he took a long, slow sip. It burned as it went down, but for some reason, it didn't provide the same comfort it usually did. Tonight, the luxurious penthouse felt cold, empty. Then a sudden thought crossed his mind. What if he went back? What if he found the man again? He could just give him a few bucks, send him on his way. It wasn't like it would cost him anything. In fact, it might make him feel a little better about the whole situation. Maybe then he could finally put it behind him. Before he could talk himself out of it, Matthew grabbed his jacket and left the apartment. It was late, but the streets of Manhattan were never truly empty, and the lights of the city gleamed like stars. He walked toward the front of his building, the sound of his shoes clicking against the sidewalk once again. But when he reached the spot where the man had been sitting, there was no one there. The bench was empty, the ground cold and still. He glanced around, searching, but the man was gone. Matthew stood there for a moment, feeling an unexpected sense of disappointment. He had hoped to find the man, to at least do something good for once. But now, all he felt was frustration. He couldn't understand why this mattered to him, why he was still thinking about it. He turned to leave, but then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something that made him freeze in place. There, across the street, standing under a flickering street lamp, was the old man. His face, illuminated by the light, was almost haunting. He was still dressed in the same tattered coat, but now there was something different in his posture, something familiar. The man turned his head, his eyes locking with Matthew's from across the street. Without a word, he began to walk slowly toward him, his gait uneven but determined. Matthew watched in disbelief. What was going on? Why was the man still here? Was he waiting for something? Before Matthew could process his thoughts, the man was standing in front of him. "Can I speak with you now, son?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time, almost pleading. Matthew looked at the man, his mind racing. There was something about him, something Matthew couldn't place, but it tugged at him, pulling at a part of his past he had long forgotten. He wanted to tell the man to leave, to walk away, but the words stuck in his throat. The man's eyes were too familiar, too knowing. "Who are you?" Matthew finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you calling me that? Why do you keep saying son?" The man's expression softened. His lips trembled as he took a deep breath, and for the first time since Matthew had met him, the old man's eyes seemed to glisten with something more than weariness, something deeper. "I'm your father," the man said, his voice quiet but firm. "And I've been looking for you for a long time." Matthew took a step back, his heart skipping a beat. The words hung in the air, unreal, impossible. His father? This man couldn't be his father. That wasn't possible. He'd been told his whole life that his father was gone, disappeared when Matthew was just a baby. "My father," Matthew repeated, shaking his head. "My father left when I was 1. He never came back. My grandfather made sure of that." The man looked down for a moment, his shoulders sagging with some unseen weight. When he finally met Matthew's gaze again, there was a rawness to his expression that Matthew couldn't ignore. "I know what your grandfather did," the man said quietly, "but I never wanted to leave. I was forced to. They said a black man could never be good enough for their family. They didn't want me, and they didn't want you. I've been trying to find you, son, for years." Matthew felt as if the ground beneath him was shifting. The words didn't make sense. His mind couldn't wrap around them. But the sincerity in the man's eyes, it was impossible to deny. Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. He didn't know what to say. Could it be true? Could this old man, this homeless stranger, really be the father he had never known? The world around him seemed to blur for a moment, and all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart in his chest. Matthew stood frozen in place, staring at the man in front of him. The words hung in the air, and for a few moments, all he could hear was the rushing of his own heartbeat in his ears. "I'm your father," the man had said, and Matthew felt as if the ground beneath him had cracked wide open. His mind raced, a whirlwind of disbelief, anger, and confusion colliding in every direction. His father, the man he had never known, the man who had been absent from his life since the day he was born, the man who had supposedly left him, leaving a hole that Matthew had filled with anger and resentment toward the absence of family. But now, here he was, standing in front of him, an old man with tired eyes, speaking words that sounded too impossible to believe. I don't understand," Matthew stammered, his throat dry. He took a step back, his mind desperately trying to process everything, but it all felt like a blur. "How could you be my father? My father left me. My grandfather made sure of that. You're not him. You can't be." The man's face twisted in sorrow, as if every word Matthew spoke was a weight on his heart. "I know what they did," the old man said, his voice steady but full of pain. "I never wanted to leave you. Your grandfather, he didn't want me in your life because of the color of my skin. He said I wasn't good enough for you, for your family. I couldn't fight them back then, but I've never stopped looking for you, son. I never stopped hoping I'd find you." Matthew's breath caught in his throat. The man's words hit him harder than any punch. His grandfather, the man who had always seemed like a rock in his life, the man who had been the cornerstone of his success and wealth, had been the one to drive his father away. Matthew's mind reeled as he pieced together the fragments of his past, the things he had never questioned until now. You were forced to leave," Matthew whispered, the realization slowly sinking in. The old man nodded slowly. "They didn't want me anywhere near you, Matthew. They didn't want their bloodline tainted. They thought I would drag you down, destroy everything they worked for. I was nothing but a distraction, a threat to their perfect, controlled life. They told me to leave, or they would make sure you'd never know the truth." He looked at Matthew, the weight of years of regret pressing down on him. "I couldn't let them hurt you, so I left. But I never stopped looking for you." Matthew closed his eyes, the weight of it all too much to bear. The idea that his grandfather, his hero, had pushed away his own father, a man who wanted nothing more than to be with his son, was a betrayal Matthew couldn't have imagined. Everything he had ever known about his family felt like it was shattering in front of him. His mind scrambled to make sense of it. "But why didn't you come back? Why didn't you try harder?" The man shook his head, his voice trembling now. "I tried. I looked for you every day. I begged for help, but it was like I was invisible. I had nothing. No one would listen to me, not without the money, not without the right skin color. I was nothing to them. And when I saw you grow up in a life I couldn't give you, I just couldn't bear to get in the way. I thought maybe it was better for you. Maybe you'd be better off without me." Tears welled up in Matthew's eyes, but he refused to let them fall. His mind was too overwhelmed, too full of shock and anger and grief. He had grown up with a sense of longing, a hunger for something that had always been missing in his life. But now that hunger had transformed into something else entirely, a deep sense of betrayal, of a family that was nothing like he thought it was. His grandfather, the man who had made him who he was, had been the one to create this rift in his life. He had built his success on a lie. Matthew looked at the old man, his face suddenly softening. This man, his father, had never given up, and despite the years of rejection, despite the pain, he had never stopped loving him. "I didn't know," Matthew whispered. "I didn't know it was like this." The old man reached out, hesitating for a moment, before gently placing a hand on Matthew's shoulder. "I'm sorry, son. I never wanted to hurt you, but I've been trying to find you, trying to make up for the years I lost. I want to be a part of your life, if you'll let me." Matthew stood there, unsure of what to say. His mind and heart were in turmoil, pulled in two different directions. Everything he had thought about family, about his father, was turning upside down. He had everything: money, success, power. But none of it had ever filled the void of not knowing where he came from, of not knowing who he truly was. He looked at the man in front of him, the man who had been a shadow in his life for so long. I don't know what to do with this," Matthew said softly. "You're telling me everything I believed in my whole life was a lie. My family, my grandfather—" "I know," the old man said gently, "but it's never too late to make things right. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance to be a part of your life. If you'll let me—" Matthew's throat tightened, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to collect himself. The world felt like it had shifted beneath him, the ground uncertain and shaky. But through all the confusion, one thing became clear to him. He had a choice, and that choice was his. "I don't know if I can forgive them," Matthew said quietly, "but I don't want to lose you again." The old man smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "That's all I've ever wanted, son." And for the first time in his life, Matthew felt the weight of years of pain, of loss, and of betrayal begin to lift. Maybe it wasn't too late after all. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally have the family he had always yearned for. The following days were a whirlwind for Matthew. He had always been in control: his business, his personal life, his image, all neatly organized in the way he had learned to manage everything. But now, nothing felt organized. Nothing felt controlled. Everything he thought he knew was unraveling. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face. The lines of age etched deeply into his skin, the pain in his eyes still fresh despite the years of separation. He had been so angry all this time, never knowing the truth. But now, faced with it, he didn't know how to process the emotions that were surging within him. He had grown up believing that he was superior in every way, raised by a man who had made sure he was always better than the rest. But the truth of his family's history, his grandfather's cruelty, his father's abandonment, was too much to take in. For days, Matthew kept his distance. He had offered his father a place to stay in one of the guest rooms in his penthouse, but every time he thought about it, a storm of confusion raged inside him. He felt guilty for having the luxury to push his father away after years of longing. And yet, he wasn't ready to let go of the resentment that had been built over a lifetime. But his father didn't push. He never asked for more than Matthew was willing to give. He didn't force himself into Matthew's world, didn't demand explanations or apologies. He simply accepted the space Matthew needed, even though Matthew could tell it hurt him. One morning, a week after their first real conversation, Matthew stood outside his building, staring at the spot where his father had been sitting when they first met. The familiar white marble facade of the building gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the man who had been abandoned not far from there, living on the streets. Matthew felt a surge of emotion, a knot in his chest that wouldn't loosen. "Hey!" a voice said softly behind him. It was his father, standing a few feet away, looking older than ever, but there was something different in the way he carried himself now. It wasn't the defeated posture Matthew had seen on that first day, but a quiet dignity that had been absent before. Matthew turned to face him, his eyes clouded with mixed emotions. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Matthew said. "About you, about what happened with my grandfather. It's hard to process. I don't know if I can forgive him or them." His father nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Forgiveness isn't easy. I don't expect it from you. All I ever wanted was for you to know the truth, and to know that I'm here if you ever want me to be." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising. "But why didn't you come sooner? Why didn't you fight for me? I could have known you. I could have had you in my life." The old man lowered his gaze, as if the weight of the years was too much to hold up any longer. "I tried, Matthew. I tried in every way I knew how, but there was no place for me in your world. Your grandfather made sure of that. You were too young to understand it back then, but he told me I'd ruin your life. He said it was better for you to grow up without me. He made it clear that I didn't belong. He said your future was already mapped out, and I had no place in it." Matthew's jaw clenched. His mind was racing. He was wrong, he said, the anger seeping into his words. He was wrong about everything. His father smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes crinkling with emotion. "Maybe, but I'm not here to make excuses for him or for myself. I'm here because I want to make things right. If I can, I want to be part of your life, even if it's in a small way." Matthew took a deep breath, the knot in his chest tightening again. He wanted to reject his father's words, wanted to lash out at the years of pain and abandonment, but part of him knew he couldn't. Not anymore. "You're right," Matthew said quietly. "I've spent so much of my life hating what I didn't know. It's like I'd built up this image of what I was supposed to be. And now everything is falling apart." His father took a slow step toward him. "It doesn't have to be a fall, son. Sometimes breaking everything down is the only way to build it back up. Maybe this is our chance to start over." Matthew looked at the old man standing before him, the father he had never truly known, the man whose face was lined with years of hardship, the man who had always loved him from afar. "I don't know what's going to happen," Matthew said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I want to try. I want to get to know you, even if it's hard." The old man's eyes filled with tears, but his face broke into the softest smile. "That's all I ever wanted. A chance." For the first time in his life, Matthew felt like he was standing on solid ground, like he was taking the first real step towards something that could change his world. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. Maybe it wasn't too late for a family for healing. Maybe there was still time to make things right. The days following their conversation felt surreal to Matthew. Each time he stepped into his penthouse, the grand space that had once been his safe haven, it felt a little less like home. There was a shift in the air, a new weight he couldn't shake. It wasn't just the weight of the years lost between him and his father. It was the realization that everything he had believed about his family and himself was built on lies. He still couldn't reconcile the image of the man who had raised him, his grandfather, with the man who stood before him now, the man who had kept him from his father for so many years. And what about his mother? Why hadn't she fought for him? Why hadn't she told him the truth? Every part of his life, every decision, seemed tainted by the choices others had made for him. It was late one evening when Matthew decided to visit his father. He hadn't seen him for a couple of days. They'd exchanged a few texts, but nothing too deep. It was as if they were both still figuring out how to navigate this new reality. Matthew parked his car in the lot outside the building where his father was staying. It was a modest building, far removed from the luxurious high-rise Matthew called home. His father had insisted on keeping his distance from Matthew's life, still unsure if he was truly welcome in it. But Matthew had made up his mind. He needed to understand the man he was beginning to know. He needed to hear his story, the parts he had never gotten to hear. As he walked up to the entrance, Matthew's phone buzzed. A text from his father. "I'm here, son. Whenever you're ready." Matthew hesitated before he responded, unsure of what to say. But the invitation was enough. He pushed open the door and made his way up the stairs to the second floor, where his father had a small apartment. It was simple, but it had a warmth to it that Matthew wasn't used to. There was a photo of his father as a young man on the wall, smiling beside a woman Matthew didn't recognize. His mother? No, it couldn't be. She had been young when Matthew was born. He knocked lightly on the door, and his father answered almost immediately. "Come in, Matthew," his father said, his voice warm but cautious, like he was still unsure of what Matthew wanted from him. Matthew stepped inside, feeling the weight of his father's eyes on him. He took a deep breath. "I've been thinking," he began. "I have a lot of questions, things I never thought to ask. I don't even know where to start." His father nodded, gesturing for him to sit on the couch. "I can't promise I have all the answers, but I'll tell you what I know." Matthew sat down, feeling the heaviness of the moment. "Why didn't you come back?" "I don't understand. I was just a kid. I didn't know anything." His father's face softened, and for the first time, Matthew saw the vulnerability that had been hidden beneath his tough exterior. "Your grandfather made sure that I couldn't. He made it clear that I had no place in your life. That's not something I could just ignore. But I never stopped looking for you, Matthew. I never stopped hoping that one day you'd know the truth, that one day you'd see me as more than just a man who walked away." Matthew's chest tightened. He felt the sting of those words, the weight of everything he had lost. "It doesn't make sense," he said, his voice shaking. "You were my father. Why didn't you fight for me?" His father's eyes darkened, the memories of that time surfacing. "I tried. I really did. But your grandfather had power, more power than I could ever hope to have. I was young, scared. I didn't have the resources, and I didn't know how to fight someone like him. I thought maybe you'd have a better life without me in it. I convinced myself that keeping away would make it easier for you." Matthew ran a hand through his hair, frustration rising within him. "But I grew up alone, not knowing you. I thought it was my fault, that maybe you didn't want me." His father sighed deeply, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't want that for you, but I didn't know how to change it. I was just a man trying to survive in a world that didn't want me, and I thought that if I stayed away, you'd be better off." The silence between them was thick, heavy with the weight of years and unspoken truths. Matthew didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to blame his father for not fighting harder, for leaving him in the dark. But another part of him understood the fear, the desperation that had driven his father's decision. And yet, the hurt lingered, an old scar that would never fully heal. "I don't know if I can forgive you for leaving me," Matthew finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can ever forget what I missed because of that." His father nodded slowly, accepting the truth. "I don't expect you to forgive me, Matthew, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how to make it right." Matthew leaned back against the couch, feeling the weight of his emotions pressing down on him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel angry. He didn't feel resentment, but he still didn't know how to move forward. He still didn't know what the future held for them, if anything. "You were right," Matthew said quietly. "I've spent so many years blaming you for things you didn't even have control over. But now I don't know what to do with all of this. With you. With everything." His father placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We take it one day at a time, Matthew. That's all we can do." The next few weeks felt like a blur to Matthew. He spent more time with his father, learning about his life, the struggles he had faced, and the reasons behind the decisions he had made. The conversations were difficult, often bringing up painful memories. But it also allowed Matthew to understand the complexities of the man who was now sitting beside him, not just as a father, but as someone who had been through his own battles. It wasn't easy, but something began to shift within Matthew. He couldn't erase the years of abandonment, the missed birthdays, the holidays without a father figure, but he started to see his father as a person, not just a symbol of all that had gone wrong in his life. One afternoon, Matthew and his father sat on the porch of the small apartment. The warm sunlight streamed across the street, casting long shadows on the pavement. The world outside seemed oblivious to the turmoil that had been brewing inside their family for decades. "You know," his father began, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about forgiveness. I don't know if you can forgive me. Hell, I don't even know if I could forgive myself for what I did. But I'd like to try." Matthew looked at him. His father's eyes filled with a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "I don't know if I can forgive you either," Matthew replied, his voice low. "But I'm not sure I need to. I think I need to understand you more than anything else. That's the only way I'll ever be able to move forward." His father nodded slowly. "I understand that. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Matthew. I just want a chance to make things right, to show you who I am now, not who I was when I made all those mistakes." Matthew let the words sink in. He didn't know what his father could possibly do to make things right, but part of him appreciated the effort. It wasn't easy to admit mistakes, especially the kind of mistakes his father had made. But this was a step forward. It was a start. "We've got time," Matthew said finally, a small, tentative smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not going anywhere." His father's face softened. "That's all I need to hear, son." As the days went on, their relationship began to shift. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect. They still had their differences, their awkward silences and unspoken frustrations. But Matthew was beginning to see that healing didn't happen overnight. It was a process, one that required patience, understanding, and above all, time. But as the weeks turned into months, something else changed. Matthew started to think more deeply about the life he had built for himself. The luxury, the status, the power, it all seemed so hollow now. What good was it if it had been built on a foundation of lies? What was the point of all the money and success if it didn't bring him the one thing he had always wanted, a sense of peace? He had spent so many years chasing the wrong things. The more he spent time with his father, the more he realized that his priorities had been completely out of line. The wealth, the expensive clothes, the fancy dinners. It all seemed so trivial compared to the relationship he had been denied. What mattered now was family. What mattered was connection. It wasn't about what you had. It was about who you had in your life. Matthew decided to make some changes. It wasn't just about healing his relationship with his father. It was about looking inward, reevaluating his own life, and making sure the choices he made from here on out were for the right reasons. That decision came on a quiet evening when Matthew sat alone in his penthouse, a glass of scotch in his hand, staring out at the city skyline. The view that had once filled him with pride now felt distant and cold. His mind wandered to his father, to the years they had lost, and to the years that lay ahead. He wondered what the future held for them. Would he ever feel whole again? Was it even possible to undo the damage that had been done? He knew it wouldn't be easy. There were no quick fixes, no magic words that would make everything right. But for the first time in years, Matthew felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them to rebuild, to create something real. Maybe there was a way to find peace in the chaos. The following morning, he called his father. "I've been thinking about things," he said, "and I want to do more than just sit around talking. I want to make a real effort. I want to spend more time with you. I want to get to know you, the man you are now, not just the father I thought you were." His father's voice cracked with emotion on the other end of the line. "Matthew, you don't know what that means to me. I don't expect miracles, but I've spent my whole life wanting this. I've spent my whole life hoping for this moment." Matthew smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. "Let's take it one step at a time, okay? We'll figure it out together." And so they did. Slowly but surely, Matthew and his father began to rebuild the bridge that had been broken for so long. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of doubt, but they were moving forward. Together, time had a way of revealing truths that Matthew hadn't been ready to see. The days spent with his father, trying to understand him, trying to repair their bond, made Matthew realize that the shackles of his past had not just held his father captive, they had held him captive, too. For all his wealth and success, Matthew had been a prisoner to his own pride, his own desire to bury the past and hide from the hurt. Yet, with every conversation, with every shared silence, his view of life began to shift. What once seemed like a harsh punishment, a reunion with the father who had left him, was now beginning to feel like the only path to freedom. Matthew no longer saw his father as the man who had abandoned him, but as someone who had suffered just as much, if not more, in a world that had never given him a chance. There were still tough moments, though. Times when Matthew would look at his father and feel the sting of all the lost years. There were moments when the anger would rise up in his chest, when he would want to shout, to demand answers to questions he had been asking for years. But instead of pushing those feelings away, Matthew allowed them to come to the surface. He knew that healing wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. One evening, as the sky outside his penthouse began to darken, Matthew sat across from his father in a small diner on the outskirts of town. The neon lights flickered above them, casting a soft glow over the table where they shared a plate of fries and 2 cups of coffee. The place was quiet, the hum of conversation from a few other customers the only sound. "I never thought we'd end up here," Matthew said, breaking the silence. His fingers drummed on the edge of his coffee cup, a nervous habit he had picked up from his father. "You and me, sitting down like this." His father looked at him with a wistful smile. "I never thought I'd get the chance to sit down with you, not after all these years." Matthew nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. "I still don't understand why you left, why you didn't fight for me. I was just a baby." The words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken for so long. His father shifted in his seat, his eyes clouded with a mixture of regret and sorrow. "I don't know if I can explain it all, Matthew," he said softly, "but it wasn't because I didn't love you. It wasn't because I didn't want to be a father. It was because I was afraid. Afraid of what your grandfather would do if he found out I was still in your life. Your grandfather, he never accepted me. He never accepted the fact that I was black. I thought if I stayed, he'd destroy everything. Matthew listened, the pieces of his father's story falling into place. He could hear the fear in his father's voice, the pain of someone who had been pushed out of his own family, rejected by the very people who were supposed to love him. It made sense now why his father had left, why he had disappeared from Matthew's life without a trace. He had been fighting for survival, not just for himself, but for the family he was trying to protect. I didn't want to hurt you, his father continued, but I thought if I walked away, if I disappeared, it would protect you from the hate I knew would follow. I thought I was doing the right thing. Matthew sat back in his chair, the weight of his father's words settling in. He had always believed the worst in the man who had abandoned him. But now, listening to the truth, he realized how much pain his father had carried all these years, and how much pain he too had been carrying. I don't know if I can ever fully understand Dad, Matthew said quietly, but I know now that it wasn't about me. It wasn't about you not caring. You were just trying to protect me in your own way. His father's eyes softened, tears welling up in the corners. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Matthew. For the first time in a long while, Matthew felt the anger in his chest begin to loosen. He didn't need all the answers. He didn't need to understand everything. All he needed was this, his father's honesty, his vulnerability. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough to begin the healing process. Matthew reached across the table, placing a hand on his father's. I don't need an apology, Dad. I just need you. I just need us to move forward. His father nodded, his voice breaking with emotion. We will. We'll take it slow. I've got time now. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did. Matthew didn't know if he could ever fully forgive his grandfather for the pain he had caused, for the family he had torn apart. But what mattered now was that he had his father back, and that, he realized, was all that truly mattered. Matthew stood by the window of his penthouse, gazing out at the sprawling city below. The lights twinkled in the distance, a reflection of the life he had built, one of success, power, and material wealth. But as he looked out over the city, he couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness that had lingered for far too long. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that could be filled with money or status. It was a kind of emptiness that only family, understanding, and love could heal. The journey he had taken with his father had been painful, but it had also been transformative. Over the past few months, they had slowly built a relationship, piece by piece, starting with the difficult conversations that tore down walls of bitterness and regret. They had shared stories, broken down old prejudices, and rebuilt their trust in one another. Matthew had finally come to understand the depth of his father's sacrifice, the pain of being torn away from his son, the fear of losing everything. It had been hard at first, and it had taken time for Matthew to let go of the anger he had carried for so many years. He had expected an apology, a simple explanation that would make sense of it all. But he had learned that healing wasn't always about closure. Sometimes, it was about letting go of the need for everything to be perfect and accepting that the past could never be rewritten. As the days passed, they spent more time together, their bond growing stronger. Matthew invited his father to his office, introduced him to his colleagues, and even took him to some of his favorite restaurants. It wasn't about showing off his wealth or status. It It was about giving his father a glimpse into his world, letting him know that he was no longer an outsider. For the first time in his life, Matthew truly saw his father as a man, not as an image of disappointment, but as a person who had fought, struggled, and sacrificed for a life that had never been his own. One afternoon, as they sat on the balcony of Matthew's apartment, overlooking the city skyline, his father spoke quietly. "You've become a man, Matthew," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I'm proud of you." Matthew looked at his father, surprised by the depth of emotion in his words. It had been so long since he had heard those words, and hearing them now brought a sense of peace he had never known. "I'm proud of you too, Dad," Matthew replied, "for never giving up on finding me, for never letting go of hope." The two men sat in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a moment of quiet reflection, the kind that came when you realize that despite everything, despite all the mistakes, the pain, and the distance, there was still a chance to make things right. And that was enough. Matthew's grandfather had passed away some time ago, but his shadow still loomed over their lives. The pain of being rejected, the weight of racial prejudice that had stained their family's history, would never fully disappear. But Matthew had come to terms with the truth that it wasn't just about the family he had lost. It was about the family he still had. His father might not have been there for him during his childhood, but they had found their way back to each other, and that was something that could never be taken away. In the days that followed, Matthew's perspective on life continued to shift. He found himself less consumed by his work, more present in the moments that mattered. He took more time to appreciate the small things. A walk in the park with his father, a quiet dinner together, a simple conversation about the past. It was in these moments that he felt the true wealth of life, not in the luxury of his apartment or the success of his career, but in the love and connection he had with the people who mattered most. As time went on, Matthew made a conscious decision to use his position to change things for the better. He became an advocate for racial justice, using his influence to speak out against discrimination and inequality. He knew that his wealth and power could be used for more than just personal gain. It could be used to heal the wounds of a broken system. He would never be able to undo the past, but he could make a difference in the future. Matthew and his father continued to rebuild their relationship, one step at a time. And as they did, Matthew realized that it wasn't the past that defined him, but the future they could create together. A future where love, understanding, and forgiveness had the power to heal even the deepest scars. And so, with each passing day, they walked forward, side by side, no longer bound by the chains of a painful history, but free to create a new legacy, one of healing, hope, and the unwavering strength of family.